This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Regina Feeney. I'm the librarian and archivist here at the Freeport Memorial Library, and I just want to welcome you to our presentation of the Jews of Freeport, a brief history of the early Jewish culture in the village of Freeport. For those of you are wondering why somebody who went to 19 years of Catholic school is doing this program, it's because a few years back, Jill Kaplan had come to me and asked me if I could do a program for her local Hadassah. And I think Jill thought maybe I could just do one of my canned presentations. And I said, well, maybe like I'd do something a little more focused and maybe do about the history of Jewish culture in the village. And she said, do you think you can do that? And I said, I'll try. Unbeknownst to Jill, several years before that, I had interviewed Bernie Kaplan and Marvin Cohen at B'nai Israel. A few of us got together from the Historic Society, went over to B'nai to learn a little bit more about the history of the synagogue. I, at that time, was doing research on the history of burials in Freeport and wanted to know where members of B'nai Israel were buried. And so I got that information. It's Old Montefiore Cemetery in Springfield Gardens. And later on, you'll hear about my misadventures in a Jewish cemetery. But those of you who know my research know that anytime I do some research, I always try to find the first instance of something occurring. So for me, I wanted to know when is the first Jewish family or Jewish person in Freeport? And I found that it was in the 1870s, which is probably about 20 years earlier than I would have suspected. I would have said 1890s. I'm not saying that there weren't Jewish people in Freeport prior to then, but it's the first documented people I could find were in the 1870s. For those of you not familiar with Freeport history, Freeport is a very diverse community. It always has. We've been diverse racially, religiously, and socioeconomically. This picture in the right-hand corner is of a class in the Freeport schools. And this is taken from a glass plate negative. Now, somewhere in that Christmas tree is a calendar, which I was able to scan into. And I found that it said January. And I could see the days and I could see the numbers, but I didn't know the year. So using a perpetual calendar, I was able to see it was January 1893. Now this made sense because this came from a collection, the Lewis Ross collection. And Lewis Ross was a member of the school board at the time. And his son, Elliot Ross, who was the young man sitting in the second row with the blonde hair and the little white Little Lord Fauntleroy outfit, that's his son. And so that would have made sense. What is interesting about that being the 1892-1893 school year is 1892 is the year Freeport incorporates. And because Freeport incorporates in 1892, there was a census done. So we know a little bit about Freeport demographically. At the time, there was 1,382 citizens in Freeport. Of that, 1,272 were born in the United States. 13 of the people living in Freeport in 1892 were African American, and we believe that would have been Moses Jarvis, his wife Henrietta, and their 11 children. And you can see that there's a few black children sitting in the front row and on the side. And we'll learn more about that family when I do my presentation on Bennington Park. There was 110 foreign-born Freeporters, but we don't know what their religious affiliation was because that was information that was not requested. But we know that the largest immigrant group at the time were Italians. There were something like 35 Italians living in Freeport at the time. But there were also 16 German families, 1 Austrian family, 3 Russians, and 22 people from England. And we do find out later that a few of our Jewish families did emigrate from England. Interesting thing about this particular picture, There's a little boy in the back. He's probably next to the Christmas tree. If you look closely, he does have a hair lip. So you have these rich kids, you got these poor kids, you have white kids, you have black kids, and most likely you probably had Christian and Jewish kids in that picture. That school will burn down in January of 1893. I'm sure it had something to do with that over-dried Christmas tree and the gas lighting that's right next to it. But the picture to the right is a picture of a sports team in the Freeport schools. And we do know that there were many players on these various sports teams that were Jewish. And in that picture is David Levy, who was the brother of George Morton Levy. He did play many sports. And we do know that his brother George and also a gentleman named Isaac Miller, they also played on semi-professional teams that also existed in Freeport. I just want to talk a little bit about how this was kind of difficult to do some research on, because until B'nai is founded in 1915, we don't really know from newspaper accounts who's Jewish and who's not. Once B'nai is founded in 1915, we get articles about people attending services and who's in various capacities at the temple. So before then, a lot of it is having to sort of I had to find out after the temple was founded, then to go back in time to see if I could find information about them. Now, keep in mind, at this time in Freeport, biblical names such as Moses, Isaac, David, and Abraham were both popular with Christian and Jewish people. So you just couldn't always go by names. And last names like Miller could go either way. Those of you, I hope you've all seen this book, Seeking Sanctuary, 125 Years of Synagogues on Long Island. Brad Collindy, who's the author, contacted me about using this picture in the lower right-hand corner. It is a glass plate negative we have at the Freeport Historical Society, and it depicts the blizzard of 1888 in the village of Hempstead. Now, this has nothing to do with Freeport, but it was an interesting photograph. So we scanned it, we put it up on our website, and one of the things we do is we transcribe all the information that's on the signs in the pictures. And that's how Brad found it, because he was doing research on a Hebrew union that existed in the 1890s in Hempstead. And according to Brad, a small group of men from Hempstead, Freeport, and Rockville Center gathered on October 24th, 1897, at the home of the department store owner Lewis Cohen in Hempstead to discuss the forming of a congregation. At the second meeting, 2 weeks later, the group became known as the Hebrew Union of the town of Hempstead, with the objective of building a synagogue and establishing a cemetery. Freeporters Morris Miller hosted the next meeting at his home on November 21st, where bylaws were adopted and the following officers were elected. Dr. Adolph Rosenthal of Hempstead, President Morris Miller, Vice President, Michael Morrison of Hempstead, Secretary, Louis Aronson of Rockville Center, and Treasurer Henry Gobetz of Freeport. He was the messenger. On November 28, 1897, the first worship services were held in that building that you see in that glass plate negative, which were the offices of Dr. Rosenthal at 50 South Main Street. Now, before then, we didn't know that there was a Freeport connection. So it was really kind of cool that having Brad do this research, we were able to now say that picture has a Freeport connection. Unfortunately, the Hebrew Union does not last. There was a disagreement with the union over what to do first, either build a synagogue or establish a cemetery. And on May 1st, 1898, the membership voted unanimously to disband. Now, at that point, a lot of Jewish families would have attended services in Rockville Center. So it's not until 1915 that B'nai Israel is formed. And it is the first mention we have of Freeport Jews in Freeport in the local press. And so we see here is an article from the Nassau Post from 1915 and the celebration of Rosh Hashanah services celebrated at Brooklyn Hall. And according to the article, they had 100 participants. Brooklyn Hall is on Brooklyn Avenue at North Grove Street. I think there's a 7-Eleven there now, and that's where the first services were held in Freeport. Then we see an article here, and I thought this was interesting, is the establishment of a Hebrew Sunday school. But the article also mentions that there were 50 Jewish members from Freeport and its vicinity. So what happens is that B'nai is renting properties around, and finally they said they're going to build a synagogue, so they look for property, and they find something up on Mount and Broadway. And I love this map because it shows that the original synagogue was built on the site of a site owned by a brewing company, which I think is kind of cool. I don't think they actually brewed liquor there or booze there, but I think it was more of a storage facility. The cornerstone was laid in 1920, and Morris Miller, he's in that picture. He's identified as the oldest member of the congregation. The temple was formally dedicated on Broadway and Mount on September 25th, 1921. The architect was C. Kern, and Freeporter James H. Lindsay was the builder. They also established a burial place for members of the congregation at Old Montefiore Cemetery in Springfield Gardens. Now, that cemetery was established around 1908. Now, just an interesting point about this synagogue, it is no longer used as a synagogue. B'nai moves later, but today that building is still standing. And according to Bragg, this is now the oldest still standing synagogue in Nassau County, even though it's a Christian. The building itself is the oldest now in Nassau County. In the 1940s, the temple purchases property and builds an extension onto the synagogue at a cost of $16,000. They had included 16 rooms, and they more than doubled their size. But this wouldn't last for long, because in the 1950s, B'nai started running out of space. Their congregation was getting larger, and the building was starting to fall apart. And they realized that they could no longer build, they couldn't add on anymore. They really ran out of space. And this is one of the questions that was asked of Bernie and Marvin. There was some belief that the congregation moved west as the neighborhood started to change and to become more African American. And they said no. They said the reason why they moved is they ran out of space, and they found some really good space in Western Freeport that they were able to create a very large synagogue that had really ample parking. So groundbreaking for the new B'nai Israel occurred on December 23rd, 1956. And Harry Shapiro was chairman of the Building Fund Committee. And $10 entitled you to help actually shovel some real dirt on the groundbreaking. And in that picture at the bottom there, that is Harry Shapiro, Rabbi Katz, and Herman Rosenstein. And temple was finally dedicated. We have the brochure from October 24th, 1965. Some of the information I was able to get is about all of this is from the Temple Messenger, which was the official newsletter of B'nai Israel. And we have a lot of these. They start in about 1939, thanks to Rabbi Katz, who was a bit of a pack rat, but we love him for it because that's where we're able to get a lot of this information. And these messengers are just really invaluable to doing any of this research. My goal is to get all of these digitized and put up online because there's so much great information. One of the things included in our information from Rabbi Katz was an old newspaper article about a Hadassah Anniversary, and since we were doing this program for Hadassah, I wanted to include that. And I want to also now talk about the Union Reform Temple. The Union Reform congregation began its services on October 1953. Now this temple served the Freeport, Baldwin, and Roosevelt area, and its first services were held at 1 East Sunrise Highway. Later that year, services were held in an old Baptist church located at 74 South Grove Street, which is now Guy Lombardo Avenue. Now, if that building, that building no longer exists, but if that looks familiar, it should, because most people believe it is the church or the building that is represented in the William Gropper painting in the Freeport post office. And William Gropper painted 2 murals in the Freeport post office as part of the Treasury Relief Art Program, which was a New Deal program. And that particular painting is called Suburban Post in Winter. Now, William Gropper was not a Freeporter. He was born in New York City and died in Manhasset. But this is his connection to Freeport painting. Now, he's an interesting person. And according to the Smithsonian, William Gropper's parents were Jewish immigrants who worked in sweatshops in New York City's garment district. After winning several prizes for his drawings, Gropper took a job with the New York Tribune. But when his bosses discovered that he had made contributions to left-wing magazines, he was terminated. In 1937, Gropper had his first show, and the New Yorker magazine described him as one of the most accomplished and one of the most significant artists of our generation. During the Red Scare of the post-war years, conservatives grew suspicious of images lambasting the rich and powerful. Gropper was asked to appear before the McCarthy Senate hearings, where he took the Fifth Amendment. He was branded a communist and saw several of his gallery shows canceled. This experience did nothing to stop the artist from making satirical images about war, prejudice, greed, and exploitations into his late 70s. And we're very, very lucky to have 2 of his paintings in Freeport. So the Union Reform Temple building was located at 475 North Brookside Avenue. And this building was dedicated on October 14th, 1960. Percival Goodman was the architect, planner, and artist. He is recognized as the nation's leading designer of synagogues. Between 1936 and 1979, he designed more than 50 synagogues and religious buildings in the United States, and that includes the spectacular Fifth Avenue Synagogue. His goal was to design synagogues that interpret Jewish tradition in modern ways, and he died at the age of 85 in 1989. The temple welcomed Temple Emmanuel of Baldwin in a merger in February 25th, 1966. And the Union Reform Temple merged with a temple in Oceanside in April 2000. It is now the home to a Hispanic church. Okay, I want to turn to sort of notable Jewish families and individuals. And I also want to tell you my crazy story about going to Old Montefiore Cemetery. I'm an archivist. I see tombstones as primary documents. And I wanted to go to document Bené's section there. So I was talking to my coworker and told her I was going to go over the weekend. And my coworker, who is Jewish, whose son's a rabbi, said to me, "You know, Regina, you can't go there on a Saturday." I didn't know that, but it completely made sense. So I went on a Sunday, and what I didn't realize is that the cemetery is very old. And if you're not familiar with Jewish burial practices, if you're Jewish, you bury side by side. You do not stack the coffins. So it's a very densely populated cemetery that uses a lot of the space. And it was not really built for someone like me driving in with a big SUV, because these tombstones are right up against the roadway. I drive in thinking I know where I'm going. I am completely lost, and I realize I cannot turn around. I have to keep going. So I drive around, and don't you know, this man appears out of nowhere. He, a very, very Orthodox Jewish man, walks out behind from one of these tombstones. I hit the brakes. He looks at me. I look at him. I'm like, "Where did you come from?" He's looking at me like, "Where did you come from?" And finally, I just make myself back to the office. For those of you who don't know me, my DNA says I am 96% Irish, and I look it, and I walk in, and I'm all sweaty and disheveled and crazed, and the woman behind the counter was like, "Can we help you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm with the Historical Society. Where is the section for B'nai Israel? I have your interment list. It should be here. I don't see it." And she looked at me and she pulls out a map and she points. And I realized, I said, your numbering system goes right to left, doesn't it? And she's like, "It does." So I ended up finding it. It took me a while, but I got the job done. Okay, so I want to talk about some prominent Jewish families in Freeport. So Morris Miller was a prominent merchant and patriarch of one of the earliest Jewish families in the village. He was born in Bohemia about 1845. He immigrated to the United States in 1865. He worked originally as an itinerant salesman. He later purchased property on South Main Street from the Methodist Church and began a dry goods business. The store was described as a wooden building with a high stoop. And in 1897, he was one of the people that helped found that Hebrew Union that later got disbanded. His son was Isaac Miller. He was born in Freeport to Morris and Fanny Miller, and he may have been the first Jewish person born in Freeport. I think he could have been. Isaac attended Freeport schools and was a pupil in the English class taught by Carolyn G. Atkinson. He was an athlete. He competed in bicycle, track, and played center field with a semi-professional baseball team. After graduating school in 1893, Miller attended a business course at Bryant and Stratton's in Brooklyn. He worked for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the New York Times, and later took over his father's dry good business. He was a member of the Freeport Independent Order of Oddfellows and served a term as the Grand Noble. He and his wife Florence were members of B'nai Israel Synagogue, and Miller died at the age of 70 after the 16 years of illness. Isaac DaSilva. His real name was Isidore. He was a pioneering businessman in Freeport. He was born in England, and he came to the United States at the age of 5, moved to Freeport in 1880. He started a business at the age of 15 in Sayville. In 1919, DaSilva incorporated his businesses under the name DaSilva 5, 10, and 25-cent Store Corporation. He had 2 stores in Freeport, one in Rockwell Center, one in Huntington, and one in Oyster Bay. His children, Louis, Jacob, Moses, Louise, and Daniel, were all involved in the family business. And the name DaSilva should, for those of you involved in the Freeport Historical Society, that name should be very familiar to you, because a lot of the postcards we have of Freeport were published by DaSilva's company. DaSilva was involved in many civic organizations, including the Elks Club, the Masons, the Freeport Club, the Foresters of America, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, and both he and his wife are buried in Montefiore Cemetery. The Schloss family, which the patriarch was Hyman Schloss. He was a prominent merchant in Freeport. He was born in Russia and immigrated to the United States when he was 25 years old and settled in Freeport around 1890. Schloss's store was at one time the largest department store in Freeport. Around 1909, his store was the first on Main Street to install gas lamps in front of the building. His store was also the first to produce window displays and install electric lighting inside the building. Schloss was a charter member of the Wide Awake Engine Company No. 1 of the Freeport Fire Department, as well as a charter member of the Freeport Exempt Firemen's Association. Schloss was also a charter member of the Sunrise Lodge, which was a Masons organization, and a charter member of the Elks. He was director of the Citizens National Bank. Schloss belonged to many organizations, including the Lights Club, the Tuscan Fellowcraft Club, the Freeport Chamber of Commerce, and the Lodge of Rebecca's. He and his family lived at 131 South Grove Street, which is now Guy Lombardo Avenue, and he and his wife Lillian had 2 children, Dr. Mervyn L. and Lawrence Leo Schloss. In 1978, Dr. Mervyn L. Schloss donated to the Freeport Memorial Library that beautiful Carillon sculpture, and a plaque that honors his parents. Hyman Schloss was vice president of B'nai Israel from 1926 to 1947, and that picture of Mr. and Mrs. Schloss is from their 50th wedding anniversary. Lillian Schloss, in her own right, was a very interesting woman. She organized a Jewish Ladies' Aid Society in Hempstead and served as its president for 25 years. She was a member of the Sisterhood of the Temple Israel and was the group's treasurer. She belonged to the auxiliary of the Freeport Exempt Firemen's Association, the Garden City chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star, and the National Council of Jewish Women. Okay, the Barasch family. Harry Barasch was a prominent merchant as well as charter member and first president of the Freeport Chamber of Commerce. He was born in Austria and he came to the United States around 1897. He was organizer of Temple of B'nai Israel and served as its president for many years. In 1921, Barasch also was involved in the movement to construct a permanent home for the temple. Barasch was also one of the original organizers of Playland Park, an amusement park located in Freeport. And the Barasch department store, where I got all my Catholic school uniforms, was located at 65 South Main Street. The Barasch family lived at 95 North Long Beach Avenue. Simon Baumann was born in France and lived in the United States for 63 years. He first opened a furniture store in Astoria in 1887. He then opened a store in Freeport in 1914 and had a store in Hempstead and Jersey City. He moved to Freeport in 1914, and he and his family lived at 64 South Ocean Avenue. He was a life and oldest member of the Queensborough Lodge of the Benevolent Protective Order of Elks, a member of the Royal Arcanum, member of B'nai Israel, and he is buried in Mount Hebron Cemetery in Queens. Family. Dr. Frank Varmus was a local doctor for 35 years. He was a general practitioner. He was also president of Doctors Hospital. Dr. Varmus was also on staff at South Nassau Communities Hospital and the Nassau County Medical Center. The Varmus family lived at 188 West Merrick Road. Some of you might be more familiar with his son, Dr. Harold Varmus, who graduated Freeport High School in 1957. Harold Varmus is a Nobel Prize winning scientist and the 14th director of the National Cancer Institute, a post to which he was appointed by President Barack Obama. Below, right next to Harold Varmus's picture, you will see a URL to the PBS series Finding Your Roots, in which Harold Varmus talks about his time in Freeport, and he really has very fond memories of his time here. And if you stick to the end, you'll see my name in the credits because I got approached to do some research on that. The Appleton family. Louis Appleton founded the Appleton Hardware Company in Freeport in 1922. He was born in Russia. Appleton had been a resident of Freeport since 1915. His wife was Ruth S. Appleton, and for several decades, the Appleton family lived at 47 North Long Beach Avenue. In the 1960s, the Appletons lived at 11 King Street. And according to the 1920 census, Appleton's profession was silk jobbing. In 1933, Appleton was elected president of Congregation B'nai Israel, and 1942, he was treasurer of the Freeport Chamber of Commerce. Their son, Dr. Arnold Burt Appleton, graduated from Freeport High School in 1935. He studied dentistry at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1942, he entered the Army and was assigned to the dental division of the Medical Corps. He later opened a practice in Freeport located at 93 South Main Street. And in 1942, he married Edith Farber. This couple had one son, Kenneth, and sadly, after a long illness, Dr. Appleton died at Mount Sinai Hospital at the young age of 31, and he is also buried in Montefiore Cemetery. The Posner family. The Posner family, you may not know the name, but you do know their business, Freeport Glazing Works, which is a staple here in the village of Freeport. You may even know one of the cousins, Herb Jurist, who is a frequent library user, and just overall great guy. So that family is also buried in Old Montefiore Cemetery. Here we have the Shebar family. The Shebars, Harry Shebar served as president of B'nai Israel. And my favorite story about the Shebar family is in the 1920s, they owned a Chinese restaurant that got raided during Prohibition on St. Patrick's Day, which pretty much sums up Freeport, a Jewish family running a Chinese restaurant that gets raided on St. Patrick's Day. Crazy stuff. Okay, the Danziger family. Milton Danziger served as president of B'nai Israel. We can see an ad here from the Temple Messenger for his sporting goods store from 1948. Abraham Siegel was owner of A. Siegel and Company, a paint store located at 99 South Main Street. Siegel moved to Freeport from Greenpoint, Brooklyn in 1916 at the age of 22. That same year, he founded A. Siegel and Company, a paint and wallpaper store. The store opened on January 29th, 1916. In 1923, Siegel helped found the Freeport Federal Savings and Loan Association, which would later become the South Shore Federal and Savings and Loan Association. And for the first 10 years of its existence, the bank operated out of his paint store. Siegel married Martha Goldstein in 1916, and the couple resided at 211 Pine Street with their 3 children. Now, the leader once referred to as Mr. Siegel as Mr. Freeport due to his many affiliations with local clubs and organizations. He was involved in the founding of B'nai Israel. He served as a trustee. He organized the Justice Lodge of B'nai B'rith. Siegel was a charter member of the Freeport Chamber of Commerce. He was a life member of the Elks, the Sunrise Masonic Lodge. Siegel served as Freeport's Park Commissioner from 1936 to 1948. And he was also founder and past president of the Paint Dealers Institution of America. And here we have just a little information about William Flaster, was also a member of B'nai Israel. He ran Flaster's Toyland, which was located at 13 West Merrick Road. Sadly, the store did burn down, and that's one of the photos we have of that, unfortunately, of that store.
Good luck.
Max Grifenhagen. This is not a name that most people are familiar with, but you are probably more familiar with the house. Max Grifenhagen had a house at 314 South Ocean Avenue. This was their summer house. He was a city person. He was the former sheriff of New York County. He was born in Chicago, and after his father died, the family moved to New York City. In his teens, Grifenhagen moved to Denver, Colorado, and engaged in the cattle industry for 6 years. He later moved back to New York. In 1880, he and his brother formed Grifenhagen Brothers, which was a wholesale dealer and manufacturer of bottles. Their company was one of the largest in the country. He also founded the Duffy Mott Company, Inc., which manufactured, sold ciders, vinegars, and owned the Monopole Vineyards Corporation in Rhymes, New York. And during Prohibition, that company sold sacramental wines and non-alcoholic beverages. There is some connection this family had to the Mott Fruit and Juice Company, but I'm not sure what that connection is, but there is some connection there. Grifenhagen served as a Republican alderman representing the Washington Heights area of New York in 1904. In 1909, he was elected New York County Register. In 1930, elected sheriff. One of his most famous prisoners or infamous prisoners was Henry Thaw, who was the murderer of Stanford White. And in 1913, Max Grifenhagen purchased this house known as Stonehurst. And he also purchased the Grove Hotel that was located at 98 Rose Street, and he ran that hotel. And his wife, Carrie, lived in the Freeport home until her death in 1942. And here we have just his sheriff's badge. In 1922, he was an executive committee member of the Campaign for Jewish War Sufferers. His name is mentioned in such prominent journals as The Advocate, America's Jewish Journal, the American Hebrew and Jewish Messenger, and the Annual Report of the Jewish Aid Society. He was involved with the Hebrew Orphans Asylum in New York City and was possibly one of its trustees. Adolph Levy. Adolph Levy was a local businessman in Freeport. He was the father of George Morton Levy, who was a prominent attorney in Freeport. He was born in Russia in 1954 and became a successful merchant. Levy came to America and worked as a salesman. He later opened a hotel, I believe in Seaford, known as Adolph's Place. After the hotel was sold, Levy and his wife Anna and their 3 children, Jean, David, and George, moved to Freeport. Here, Levy purchased a haberdashery, and the store became a successful men's clothing store. His son, David, the baseball player, soon took over his father's business. And David, in his own right, was a charter member of the Exchange Club. He served as its president. He was a director of the Freeport Bank, as well as the Long Island Trust Company. And for about 10 years, he was a town of Hempstead councilman. He and his wife, Florence, lived at 246 South Ocean Avenue. Brother George Morton Levy was a prominent attorney, as well as founder and president of Roosevelt Raceway. Levy was born in Seaford and his parents' hotel. When George was a year old, his family moved to Freeport. While at Freeport High School, Levy was vice president of the debating club, played baseball and football. After graduating in 1904, Levy attended New York University. He graduated from that institution with a law degree in 1908. He briefly worked for the law and real estate firm Smith & Levy. And in 1911, he entered a partnership with attorney Elvin Ed Edwards, who was another big attorney here in Freeport. Levy became a successful criminal attorney. His first case to bring him international notoriety was the murder of Louise Bailey. Louise Bailey was murdered by Florence Carman, Louise Bailey was a patient of Florence's husband, Dr. Carman, and she shot through the window. Mrs. Carman shot Louise through the window, killed her. And after 2 trials, Mrs. Carman was acquitted. And that sort of led him to become this really great defense attorney. And during Prohibition, he took the cases of many accused rum runners and he got them all off. He also defended mobster Lucky Luciano in 1936. And Levy was a friend and golf partner of underworld crime boss Frank Costello. Levy was inducted into the Hall of Fame of Trotters because there was a lot of trotter racing going on at Roosevelt Raceway. And he was inducted to that Hall of Fame in 1966. He died at the age of 89. The Frisch family. Again, you probably don't know the family, but you might remember the store. They owned Jack and Jill's Children's Shop, which was a children's clothing store located at 83 South Main Street in the 1940s and 50s. Murray Frisch was the owner, and the family lived at 51 Chouinard Avenue, and they were also members of B'nai Israel. Carol Green's. So this is the Green family. They owned Carol Green's, a ladies' apparel store located at 80 South Main Street. The store was founded by brothers Jack and Harry Green around 1930. The store was named for Jack's daughter, Carol. Originally located at 60 South Main Street, Carol Green's took over space occupied by the Litwick department store at 80 South Main Street in 1922. And Carol Green's also had a location in Hempstead. During a Freeport war bond campaign in 1943, Carol Green's purchased $12,500 in war bonds. It was reported that this was the largest individual purchase of these bonds in Freeport. When Jack retired from the store and moved to Florida, relatives Walter and Ruth Green managed the business. In 1965, Carol Green celebrated its grand reopening after a redesign, and Carol Green's but unfortunately, Carol Green and his neighbor's Irving men's shop were damaged in a fire around 1972. Carol Green celebrated its 50th anniversary in 1981. In December of 1981, Walter retired from the business and closed the store. The Green family was also associated with B'nai Israel. Carol Green was confirmed in the temple in 1943. She married Ira L. Kaplan in 1950, and he worked for the Freeport company, Nassau Mattress and Bedding Company. Okay, you always got to talk about Lou Reed when we talk about Freeport. Lou Reed, musician, was born in Brooklyn and grew up in Freeport at 35 Oakfield Avenue, and he was bar mitzvahed at B'nai Israel. He graduated from Freeport in 1959. During those years, he played in a number of bands and made his first recording as a member of the doo-wop group The Shades. He graduated from Syracuse University with a BA in 1964, where he expanded his interest to free jazz and other experimental types of music. He moved to New York City and took a job as a songwriter for Pickwick Records. After playing with a few groups, he formed the Velvet Underground in 1965, and his solo career started in 1971. He became a widely respected member of the music industry and was inducted in 1996 to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. One interesting note to mention about Lou Reed, his most popular song is probably Walk on the Wild Side, and you see the record there in the top left-hand corner. If you look under the word Victor, you'll see Oakville Avenue Music Limited. That is his music label. That he named his music label after the street he grew up on in Freeport. Yeah. Freeport merchants. Here we have, this is a 1957. In 1957, the officers included Mervyn Baumann, Edor Hirschenfeld, and Herman Barasch. Missing from this picture are Murray Newer, Irving Grebenar, Dave Levy, and Milton Danziger, who were all officers of the Freeport Merchants Association. This organization organized in 1927, and in 1928, the association had 50 members, with Abraham Litwick serving as president. Around 1932, the Freeport Merchants Association merged with the Freeport Chamber of Commerce. 5 years later, the association organized again with Irving Grebenar as its president. Freeport's first election day sale was organized by the Freeport Merchants Association in 1949. And during the Christmas season in 1957, the Freeport Merchants Association sponsored a Santa Claus visit where Santa Claus arrived by helicopter. We had pictures of that. And in 1960, the Freeport Merchants Association once again merged with the Freeport Chamber of Commerce, becoming the real estate division of the chamber. Since this is Freeport and we must always talk about Rumrunning, Dutch Schultz, a notorious German Jewish gangster whose real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, was not a Freeporter. But he does have a Freeport connection because he bought 3 rum-running boats from the Scopanage Freeport Point shipyard. These boats included 3 Packer Liberator 500 horsepower air-cooled engine. Basically, they're repurposed World War I airplane engines. They included bulletproof gas tanks and room for 600 cases of liquor. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the newspaper coverage of that early, how Jewish people were covered in early newspapers. So one of the early things I found was, this is from the Long Island Farmer from 1901, and I thought this was sort of interesting. In 1901, Jewish butcher shops in New York wanted to close they wanted to be open on Sundays, and a judge said no way, even though their Sabbath was Saturday and they wanted to be closed they want to switch it, but that this couldn't happen, right? But I wanted to show that in other articles, and these are Freeport newspapers, there is a lot of emphasis made to sort of talk about Jewish holidays, explain to people why some of the stores would be closed. So here you see an article, they talk about Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and what they are and what the celebration is about, which I thought was really kind of a cool thing. Here is Jewish holidays such as Hanukkah being discussed. And this is an interesting article from the Temple Messenger. It's entitled Hanukkah or Christmas. And this was aimed at parents with Jewish children in the temple. You know, how do you sort of talk about Christmas versus Hanukkah when so much of everything is pointing towards Christmas, but we don't celebrate Christmas. We should be celebrating Hanukkah. So this is really sort of an interesting article I found in the Messenger. Other articles include a lot of sort of ecumenical sort of religious outreach. Here we see an article from 1909 where a Hebrew missionary speaks, is an invited guest at a Methodist church. Another article is about how a rabbi's wife actually gave a sermon at the synagogue, and a Methodist minister as a guest speaker at B'nai Israel, talking about a topic, If I Were a Jew. Okay, this is sort of an interesting article, and I realized that reading this article about a young person is having a reception honor their son at a month old, and they're collecting coins, and I'm like, this has got to be a religious thing, and it is. And this is I believe this is Lois House's dad, Bernie Calvin, and this was a reception, and it is the redemption of the firstborn son, and they collect money, and the Calvin family actually donated the money to war sufferers. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the dark side of Freeport history and sort of the strange incident that took place in Freeport with the Ku Klux Klan in 1924. But a little background on the Klan. The Klan first comes to Freeport about 1922, and the Klan is really sort of organized because of the lawlessness in Long Island, due towards prohibition. Like, there was so much booze being run through this town, and most cops were looking the other way, and so the Klan didn't like it. The fact that there were so many immigrants and Jews and Catholics involved in the rum running industry wasn't helpful. So they organized, and things were, they would kind of like try to scare establishments that they thought were, selling liquor by posting stuff on their door. But things got really kind of scary in 1924 when drugstore owner Ernest Lewis is kidnapped. And we know a lot about this story because Herb Juris in the 1970s did an incredible amount of research for a paper entitled Public Activities and Response to the Ku Klux Klan in Freeport, 1922 to 1933. That paper has been transcribed. It is available online, and I'll tell you where that is at the end. And he describes what was going on in Freeport around this kidnapping. He does describe in his paper an anecdotal account of a Jewish dentist in Freeport being offered Klan membership by a patient, and like, okay, no. And another Jewish merchant told him how he sold clothing to the Klan, but admitted that he actually overcharged them by changing price tags. Now, Ernest Lewis owned a pharmacy on Bayview and Atlantic Avenue, and in 1924, it was claimed that he made a pass at a 13-year-old girl. Now, Herb Juris interviewed people from B'nai Israel and other merchants that knew him, and they said, listen, that was not something he would have done. His wife was in the store at the time. The girl's mother was in the store. It just was so out of character. But what they think happened is he may have sprayed perfume on her collar and said something like, oh, that smells nice, and she took it the wrong way. The mother ran up to the police justice, who was Hilbert Johnson, who just dismissed the case, saying that there's nothing here. but somehow the Klan got involved and they threatened him. And he does not, he gets all these letters telling him to leave. He refuses to leave, and then he is kidnapped. And this is a copy of a police blotter we have at the Freeport Historical Society. And you can see it at 1142, you see that a report comes in of Ernest Lewis getting kidnapped. Now, this is one of the crazier kidnappings I've ever heard about. It involved 3 men and 2 boys kidnapping Ernest Lewis. And during the kidnapping, it is reported that one of the kidnappers cursed or used a vile term, and he gets reprimanded by the other Klansmen. So Ernest Lewis is getting kidnapped, and the 2 Klansmen start having a fight, which is strange. They take him, they leave him in another town, and then they say to him, "Oh, do you need any money to tie you over?" And he's like, "No, I'm good. I'm really good." He does come back to Freeport, and he decides, "I'm out of here." And he sells the business, and he and his family leave. But this is not the end of the case. He gets indicted by the Nassau County courts for quote unquote impairing morals. He was a member of the Freeport Fire Department, and his membership gets suspended. And after 2 trials, he is found guilty and sentenced to 90 days in jail. Later, there was a parade in Freeport, and one of the floats was entitled, it was a Klan parade, and there was this float that was called "We Protect American Womanhood," and it featured a man staring out a store window, leering at a little girl surrounded by protective Klansmen, and the store name was Enticer. Okay, I have a little bit of a connection to this story because the 13-year-old girl that made this claim was the little old lady who grew up across the street from me here in Freeport. A bit of an odd bird. She lived there with her brother. There was obviously some mental illness going on, definitely some alcoholism. And I would just describe them as just, in general, just being really, really paranoid. So they were sort of an odd group there. Okay, let's talk a little bit, something a little lighter. Let's talk about the Milburn Country Club, which was developed in the northwest section next to Milburn Creek. And it ran from Stearns Park to Grand Avenue. In 1916, a group of New York City men met with Hugo Stearns, the owner of this property, and they offered to buy land for a country club. And by the early 1917, the group undertook the construction of a golf house, a golf course, and tennis courts. In 1919, membership dues were $100, and for many years, the club catered to primarily Jewish patrons. In 1920, the links were reorganized as the Milburn Golf Course, and William Fox of 20th Century Fox Movie Studio, Marcus Lowe of the Theater Family, and George Z. McAdee, former U.S. Attorney General, were among its members. If you go into the sanctuary of B'nai Israel, you will see a plaque dedicated to a number of Freeporters who died in World War II. These were members of the congregation. And I just want to I really want to talk about them and their very short lives. Israel Edelman was enlisted in 1942. He was awarded the Purple Heart. He died at the age of 23. He was originally buried in France and was reinterred in Mount Ararat Cemetery in Farmingdale. He lived at 123 Denhoff Avenue. Arthur Goldsmith was awarded the Purple Heart. He died at the age of 27. His address was listed as 481 Archer Street. He was originally interred in New Guinea and then eventually reinterred in Mount Lebanon Cemetery in Glendale. Warren Gollander was awarded the Purple Heart. He died at the age of 22, and he entered the Army from New York City. He is buried at Mount Ararat Cemetery in Farmingdale. Ernest Mintz, I don't really know that much about. He probably was not a Freeporter, but his uncle was Sidney Mintz of 150 Graphing Place in Freeport, and he had served as the temple's financial secretary. Irving Reich was awarded the Purple Heart. He enlisted in 1943 and died at the age of 19. He lived at 148 Pine Street. He graduated Freeport High School in 1943. And he is buried in Wellwood Jewish Cemetery. I don't read Hebrew, but I do have, I believe the translation at the bottom says, "May the soul be bound up in eternal life." William Serby was awarded the Purple Heart. He died at the age of 26. He was on the USS President Coolidge, which was a converted luxury liner that hit an American mine during the war, somewhere in the southwestern Pacific. He lived at 24 High Place, and he graduated Freeport High School in 1935. Okay, one of the reasons why, going back to the Temple Messengers, is they have some of these great little vignettes about young people getting their bar mitzvahs, and I think they're sort of very fun to read. Some of the other things that come up in the Temple Messenger are discussions about Zionism and the formation of Israel. And finally, I just want to show that we also have some things related to the 70th anniversary of Congregation B'nai Israel in the archives of the Freeport Historical Society. And finally, I just want to say shalom, and I want to say that in 2014, the Landmarks Commission was able to dedicate a roadside marker outside the original B'nai Israel, and it is, like I mentioned before, is the oldest still standing synagogue in Nassau County. And for those who want to do a little more research, I have a list here of where you can access our newspapers. If you want to listen to the oral history that we put together of Bernie Kalman and Marvin Cohen, there's a link to it. And also on the Freeport Library's webpage, I will have recordings of all these presentations that I do. So if you missed anything and you want to go back, you'll find them links to our YouTube page, and they will all be there. So if anybody has any questions or any comments, just open your mics up and let's go.
Regina, it's a Paul Kaplan. I know you like being accurate. I ride by and walk by Lou Reed's house quite a bit, and I believe it's in the intersection of Oakfield and Maxon, not Oakfield and Wilson.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Also, I was curious because I'd love to get a business card where I'm in the National Order of Odd Fellows. What is that?
Most of these groups were like drinking clubs. But if you go to, you see where I have the link to the Freeport History Encyclopedia. I do have a history of them online. It was a fraternal organization.
Regina, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
It's Mary Hessel, and I'm wondering if Barasch's department store, where did the family live? Was it on Pennsylvania Avenue?
I think I have the address here. Hold on one second. They could have moved, but I have their address as 60. So that was the store, 65 South Main Street. The family lived at 95 North Long Beach, but they could have moved. But that was one of the addresses.
Okay, thank you.
Regina, could you repeat where the old B'nai Israel is located? What's the address?
Sure. Let me just. It's located at the corner of Broadway and Mount, north. And it looks exactly the same, except it has a cross on top of it. The building is completely the same. Any other questions? We're good? All right, guys. Listen, if you have anything else, just feel free to contact me at the library. Or if you have any ideas for programs, stay tuned. We're going to do some more of these. I think they're a lot of fun. If you find any more information, just pass it over to me. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you
Thank you
so much.
Thank
You
you.
are amazing, Regina. Thank you.